Welcome, everyone, to the Christchurch Rica Rectors Forum. My name is Daniel London. I'm the rector, and I am very excited to welcome my friend and clergy colleague, the Reverend Jim Richardson, who I first met when I was in the Bay Area, when he was serving as the interim rector at Incarnation in Santa Rosa during a very tumultuous time as the Tubbs fire was wreaking havoc. That was about 4 years ago, almost exactly.
Yeah, 4 years ago, exactly. Yeah.
You then served as the interim dean at our Diocesan Cathedral, Trinity Cathedral in Sacramento, which I believe is also your sponsoring parish.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes, and I know you've served at other parishes, like one in Virginia. You've had other occupations, like one in journalism. And so I'd love to begin by inviting you to flesh out your biography a bit. Just tell us your story, tell us your background and your journey to the priesthood and to the present moment.
Well, I was born and raised mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area. My parents grew up in Oakland and went to Cal Berkeley, and so I was born at Alta Bates Hospital in Berkeley. And then eventually I made it somehow through high school and went off to college. I went to UCLA, and then I was completely smitten with journalism, and I became a newspaper reporter. And I did that for about 25 years. Most of that time in Southern California, at the Riverside Press Enterprise, and then the San Diego Union. Okay. And then in 1985, I was offered the position of the state capitol correspondent for my first paper, the Riverside paper. So that's how I got to Sacramento.
And did you meet Lori in the journalism world?
Yeah, so we did. So I came here in 85 and for my old paper, and then the Sacramento Bee hired me away, and that's where I met my wife-to-be. She was an editor in the features department at the Bee, and that's where we met. And there was actually, in those days, there were quite a few couples at the Bee, so quite a few people either met at the Bee or brought a spouse. So it was actually kind of normal.
Yes.
But I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and I remember when I was a teenager, there was a really old man. He was probably 40 years old. He was quitting his business career to go off to seminary. And I remember it just sort of hit me. I thought, you know what? I think I'm going to do that, just like Carl. But I'm going to do it just like him at a second half of life.
Second career, yeah.
And actually, Carl ended up a priest, and he moved to the Bay Area, and he ended up presiding at our wedding.
Oh, wow.
He was in the Diocese of California, Carl Gracely, and at age 101, he was the oldest active priest in the Episcopal Church.
Wow.
He was a chaplain at John Muir Hospital. Anyway, he was my great inspiration. And
was that his main ministry?
Well, he was also pretty much, yeah, chaplaincy was his, hospital chaplaincy was his main ministry, and he was attached to St. Timothy's in Danville, which was my parents' church, which is where we got married. So
is that where you grew up, at St. Timothy's?
No, I really grew up on the San Francisco Peninsula, in Belmont, and then before that in San Jose. So Contra Costa County is really where my parents retired. So
got it. So which Episcopal churches did you grow up attending?
Oh boy. Okay, so in San Jose, this is the trivia question. There was St. Francis Episcopal Church in San Jose, and then in Belmont, I think it was Good Shepherd Church, and Bishop Pike confirmed me.
Oh wow, the notorious, the infamous.
And my mother loved Bishop Pike, mind you, and my mother was pretty conservative, but what she loved about Bishop Pike is he paid attention to people and paid attention to her. So
did you have any personal interactions with him?
Oh, well, I was 10 years old or 13 or something. And it was back when we were doing childhood confirmations as a ticket to communion, which will bring us to a current issue. But
Yes, right, right.
but anyway, that's where I grew up. Anyhow, I ended up as a journalist. That old feeling that I was going to be a priest came back to me, and I kept going, "Oh no, 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 God, this is a really bad idea. This is not me, for goodness sake. I'm a journalist." But it just would not leave me. And so I entered the discernment process. By then, we were very active at Trinity Cathedral as lay people. I had been the senior warden.
With Don Brown, with the
Don Brown,
yeah.
and but I was just running out of excuses. So, but I entered the discernment process with Bishop Lamb, and I took extra long time. Unlike other people I know who wanted to kind of get through it fast, I was like, "Well, let's take our time. Let's be sure of this." So it took me about 7-8 years. But I ended up going off to our seminary in Berkeley, the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and graduated in the year 2000, the class of So, and I ended up going called back to the cathedral by Dean Brown, and I was there for I think 6 or 7 years, and then when he retired,
what were you? Were you like an associate, or were you a canon?
I started out as the associate, the canon for adult education. And in those days, we had a much bigger staff than now, and so my entire responsibility starting out was our education program for adults, which was pretty extensive. And then eventually, I became the associate dean with more administrative responsibilities. It was more like a chief of staff kind of job. So I ended up giving up the adult ed piece to do all that work. And then Dean Brown retired, and so a new dean came in, and so I went out. And then a few steps along the way, I was the interim at All Souls in Berkeley for a year. And then because I was in Berkeley, a church in Charlottesville, Virginia, found me. And Charlottesville is a University of Virginia. So I ended up being called to Charlottesville. And I was the rector of St. Paul's Memorial Church, which is directly across the street from Mr. Jefferson's University. And
I was just there a few months ago. I was at Monticello.
Wow. Yeah, wow.
First time. And I'm actually wearing, this is going to be weird, but I'll probably edit this out. But I'm wearing socks I bought at Monticello.
Oh, wow.
Martin Luther King Jr. socks.
That is cool.
I love socks.
I love it. I want a pair. So
yeah.
We've been to Monticello many, many times.
It was impressive. I loved how they did not turn a blind eye to the shadow side of.
And that's fairly recent, within the last decade. And they've been rebuilding the slave quarters to show what it really looked like. And anyway, I was at St. Paul's Memorial, and I was there 7 years through all sorts of various ups and downs. And then in 2015, Bishop Barry Beisner asked me to apply at Church of the Incarnation in Santa Rosa. So I did, and one thing led to another again, and I ended up at Incarnation in Santa Rosa in 2015.
And you were there for how long?
I was there for 3 years through the fires, and I was the priest in charge, but
priest in charge.
But it was in a very difficult time for that congregation, and we did a lot of really hard work around conflict and some things. And I realized 2 years into it, they really needed a longer term rector or someone younger than me.
And your successor, who also served as interim rector or interim priest in charge at All Souls, says that, because I know some of the history of Incarnation for you. He said that there's been so much healing, and it's been so much because of your leadership, especially during such a difficult time. So
Thank you.
He's very indebted to you.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, that's, I was there during the fires, and learn more about disaster relief than I ever wanted to know.
Yeah, right.
And then in 2018, the dean of the cathedral, Brian Baker, who had succeeded Don, decided to move on, and I was asked to be the interim. And so, and I absolutely, that was really after I indicated I was going to be leaving Incarnation. So I was really on the way out anyway. So, but it felt like a perfect capstone to my ordained life.
A
And
bookend, right? Yeah.
yeah, and I was supposed to be there a year, and then COVID hit, and so I was there 2 years, and then Matthew Woodward was called as dean, and he is fantastic, and so I retired almost exactly a year ago. So
Yeah, and you were dean while we were electing, right? And
yeah,
consecrating our
yeah,
new.
I was on the standing committee during the
That's right.
election
That's right.
of Bishop Megan Trackware, and so I've kind of gotten to know this diocese over the
Yes,
years, even
indeed.
though I was away for quite a while. So
And right, and you obviously know a lot about the Episcopal Church and the way
yeah,
the polity functions, and I want to kind of pick your brain about convention and general convention and all that.
okay. So General Convention is the highest governing body of the Episcopal Church. It's really an elected legislature, which is no accident, since the people who designed the US Constitution also designed a governance system for the Episcopal Church. So it is a bicameral legislature, and the lower house is called the House of Deputies. And each of the 110 dioceses of the Episcopal Church, which includes some dioceses that are not physically in the United States. Each diocese elects deputies, and by the way, not delegates. We elect deputies, and each diocese has 4 clergy and 4 lay deputies. So it's not really a proportional house like the U.S. House of Representatives, but it's closely. General Convention meets every 3 years. Because of COVID, it has not met. So it will be meeting next summer for the first time in 4 years. General Convention floats around the country. Next year it will be in Baltimore. The upper house is the House of Bishops. So every bishop of the Episcopal Church is a member of the House of Bishops, including retired bishops. And there has been some effort to limit the number of retired bishops coming to convention, but we need not worry ourselves about that. But it is also more than a legislature. It is the biggest gathering of Episcopalians that we have, although there are 700 deputies and a couple of hundred bishops. So maybe 1,000 representatives. There's usually 10,000 Episcopalians on hand. It's huge, and it's kind of Episcopal palooza. It goes on for 10 days, pretty much morning, noon, and night. There's an exhibition hall. There's all sorts of events. There's a daily Eucharist, and which is really actually one of the great high points of the day, because it's always something very different, and it's quite remarkable. But again, General Convention is what governs our church. So every controversial issue we have in our church and in our world lands on the doorstep of General Convention. So all of the many years of arguing and debating and dialoguing and having conflict over sexuality issues, over marriage issues, all of that was focused on General Convention. And there's always lots of things focused on General Convention. It's also where we take official positions on issues of the day, whether it's gun control or abortion or you name it, we take a position, and not easily often. General Convention is who is in charge of our liturgy. The Book of Common Prayer is authorized by General Convention, and there has not been a new Book of Common Prayers authorized since 1979. So there has been many, in recent years, there's been a lot of push to come up with a new one or revise it. And what has happened is supplemental books have been issued. So a priest friend of mine says, the Book of Common Prayer has children. So I'm kind of narrowing down to where I want to talk about, which is our church has a calendar that's like a calendar of saints. And just about every day has at least one person or group of people who are commemorated on the calendar. And it's in a supplemental book called Lesser Feasts and Fasts. And Lesser Feasts and Fasts has sired some children by other names. So it gets kind of confusing. Yes, we've had A Great Cloud of Witnesses is the current supplement to the supplement Lesser Feasts and Fasts. Anyway, there are 300 individuals on this calendar. And many of them are people you've probably heard of, people we share with other churches, St. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine of Hippo, the saints of the early church are on our calendar. But there are also many recent additions that are on our calendar and not necessarily on anybody else's. You don't have to be an Episcopalian to be on our calendar. So the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is on our calendar. John Muir is on our calendar. I don't think he's on anybody else's calendar, but he's on ours. But one of the things that really stands out, and I think has really come into high relief in the last really few years, is that of those 300 individuals on the calendar, only 10 are Black Americans, only 10. And so there is now a push to do something about that. And I will, at some point I'll argue about why I think we have systematically excluded Blacks. I think there's something in the way we adopt the calendar that has served to exclude. And I will give you my position, which others may disagree with quite fairly. But anyway, Lewis Powell, who's now Brother Simeon Lewis Powell, who is a deacon, and he's Black, he's in our diocese, and Lynn Zender, who's an activist, and she's a member of St. Martin's in Davis. The three of us have proposed putting John Lewis and Howard Thurman on the calendar, and we can talk more about who they are. But the first step is for our diocese to make this request of General Convention. So we have two resolutions, one for Lewis and one for Thurman, that will be at our Diocesan Convention in a couple of weeks. And we're asking that our convention endorse having Thurman and Lewis on the calendar and forward this request to General Convention next summer. So I don't want to deceive people. I am certain that this will be a multi-year process, that we will get to General Convention and they will at best want to study it. I really don't think there's going to be a show of hands saying yes, but I think getting on the calendar ought to be hard. So, and bear further study, but it's time to get started.
Yeah, well, and at least this is an opportunity to teach people in the diocese, at least the delegates and others, about these two great individuals. Exactly. I'm curious what brought you to want to lift those two up in particular. And I just want to recognize that part of your biography also includes writing a biography about Willie Brown. So you have been immersed in, a kind of Black American world, politically speaking, and these two certainly have had a huge influence politically, especially Congressman John Lewis. But yeah, what brought you to, or brought you and brothers Simeon Lewis Powell and Lynn Zender to focus on these two?
Well, it's actually an outgrowth of the work I've been doing on a new book. um, I've been writing a book which will be published next year.
Yes, I remember you.
After General Convention, but anyway, it'll be. It's a book about my anti-slavery abolitionist ancestors and how they have shaped me and my family, and I have a lot of material about them. But what I wanted to do in writing this book was to deepen my own understanding of Black politics, the Black church, Black theology, who is really, who are the voices who ought to be heard universally. And what really first jumped out at me is Howard Thurman, who is a tower. Thurman was born in I think 1899. He died in 1981. He was hugely influential on Martin Luther King Jr. He was actually friends with King's father. They were actually quite tight. And so Thurman in 1949 wrote this book called Jesus and the Disinherited, right there. And it really sets forth the foundations for nonviolent resistance by Black Americans. It's not abstract, but it's deeply theological. And King carried that book with him everywhere he went. Thurman was a mentor to many of the civil rights leaders of the 40s and 50s and 60s. He mentored Pauli Murray, who is the first Black woman priest in our church, and she is on our calendar.
That's right.
But her mentor is not. So,
and there's a new documentary about her on Amazon.
Yes, there is. So we at least have Pauli Murray on there, but there are more voices that need to be there. So, so getting to John Lewis, kind of just was so obvious I missed it almost. In work some years ago when I was in Charlottesville, I was invited to an evening with John Lewis, who was in Charlottesville promoting a book he had written, a more recent book.
Cross That Bridge.
I got to spend an evening with John Lewis, and I started. It was at an author party, so there's a lot of people. But I told him about my book project, and he said, "Oh, come here, let's go sit in the corner and talk about it." So he had an amazing, wonderful evening, and he was just so utterly supportive of this work I was doing. So
that's huge. He was such a hero and inspiration for Barack Obama, and
absolutely
to have him to be able to engage with him such a privilege and gift. Wow.
So Lewis was born in Alabama, the Alabama sharecroppers. He ended up in Nashville going to a Baptist ministry school. He was one of the first freedom riders. He got off a bus in South Carolina and was severely beaten. He ended up the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was one of the organizers of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He was beaten by, nearly died. He was beaten so severely. He was one of the organizers of the March on Washington, where King gave his I Have a Dream speech. And then eventually Lewis was elected to Congress in 1986, and he served, represented a district from Atlanta. and he died last summer. John Meacham, some of the folks watching this may be familiar with John Meacham, who's written some really excellent books. He's written biographies on Thomas Jefferson, on George H.W. Bush.
And he's an Episcopalian, right?
And he's an Episcopalian.
The National Cathedral.
The canon at the National Cathedral. And he wrote a recent book on John Lewis. And I was reading that book earlier this summer, the Meacham book on Lewis, and he had this, in the introduction, he just put forth, he said, here is why John Lewis should be a saint. He is a saint, I mean, he just laid out, here's the criterion for sainthood in the Christian world, and this meets who John Lewis is. And I thought, all right, we're doing Thurman, we got to do John Lewis. So that's how we ended up with John Lewis. So, it all sort of connects up. So, and Lewis's mentor was Martin Luther King. So you can kind of you can connect the dots from Thurman to Daddy King to Lewis. I mean, it's all connects up. So.
Well, so there are a few questions I have. And some of these came up at the town hall. But first of all, yeah, he died. It's been a little bit more than a year since he died.
Yeah.
And I know that there's discussion, maybe even a possible resolution around a certain minimum amount of years after one dies before they can become part of the calendar.
Yeah, so there is a proposal at General Convention. There is a committee that looked at all of this, an interim committee that looked at the calendar and kind of truthfully, the haphazard way we do things on that calendar. There's never really been written criterion for how to get on. So they have a proposal with a set of criterion, and one of the criterion is that you need to be dead for 50 years, unless you're a martyr. So
right, like Jonathan Myrick Daniels,
right, or King, or Oscar Romero, who's not been dead 50 years. So. What's interesting in the Meacham book is he makes, got to read you this from Meacham. One test of a saint, closely tied to the test of a martyr, is the willingness to suffer and die for others, which Lewis was willing to do again and again and again. So Meacham's making the argument that, well, Lewis almost was a martyr, so don't penalize him for living, for surviving.
That's right. Yeah, he said he saw death at
so
Edmund Pettus Bridge. Yeah.
And I get the 50. I get the time is important, but what it also does, if you wait too long, the people of one generation have never had an opportunity to tell people of future generations who is important to them. This is how we tell those who come after us, here were the faithful people we hope you will learn about and maybe not emulate your life, because I don't really want you to go get beaten up 40 times, but that you will be inspired by, and that you can model, you'll find courage from. I mean, so who is important to our generation? And it's these people.
Yeah, you mentioned the John Meacham book on John Lewis, and I definitely want to check that out. There's a book, a new biography on Desmond Tutu that just came out, written by my sponsoring priest, Michael Battle, who now teaches at General Theological Seminary. And I haven't read it, but at the beginning, like John Meacham, he makes an argument. I mean, he's really trying to make an argument that Desmond Tutu is a saint. And I'm thinking about, as you know, St. Gregory of Nyssa, they have that, those paintings of saints, all of whom have passed on and died, I think, much more than 50 years ago. But then there's Desmond Tutu, who's still alive. And so, yeah, it makes me wonder. Like, yes, I can understand why 50 years. They want to kind of give 50 years to maybe, I don't know, maybe see how long the legacy lasts, or how long the influence lasts. Or I'm kind of curious what their reason.
Well, and it's a little bit of a catch-22. If you don't put them on a calendar, we're going to forget about them.
Right. Well, and also there's
maybe, I mean, we haven't forgotten Franklin Roosevelt, but but kind of we remember presidents, but people of faith, we tend to kind of lose sight of them after a while.
There's also this reality that when when somebody has passed on and it's been some time, we kind of put them on this pedestal that that defangs them in a sense, right? Like I think, people compare the Black Lives Matter movement, they contrast it with Martin Luther King Jr. and say, oh, MLK and John Lewis, they were all about nonviolence. And yes, they were. And yet they caused a real commotion, and they were considered kind of a threat to safety for many,
Huge.
just as BLM is considered today.
Well, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about that. And they were committed to merely not being violent.
Right.
They were committed to nonviolent resistance.
Right.
That there was a method to this, that it took actually more strength in the face of hatred and persecution to stand up to it. And it did change the world. It absolutely did. The other criterion they have, which I think is a problem, is those on the calendar. It says, well, first, the criterion is that the person must be already celebrated locally by churches. And it's, on first impulse, it's a very laudable criterion. It's saying that we want the celebration of saints to come from the grassroots, from the people themselves, rather than the top down saying, here's who a saint is, celebrate them. So I get that. But the problem is, to be blunt about it, this is a predominantly white church.
Right.
The chances of a predominantly white church celebrating the lives of Black people is not great, I don't think, or even knowing who they are. Even having heard of Howard Thurman.
Right. I think a lot of people
church don't. You might have, but not necessarily in a white church. So, and I think that's the real reason why there's only really 10 Black people on the calendar, because a predominantly white church isn't really going to know about them. So there's got to be some other opening here. So yeah, this needs to come up from the grassroots, but it also, we need to be able to hear other voices that are not predominant in our dominant white European culture.
Right.
And I don't know any other way to do it except surface these people. And to say, the other thing I find kind of odd, it says that we want you to do liturgy, already be doing liturgy around them. But we also want you only to be in the Book of Common Prayer and supplements. So it feels a little tension in there.
Catch 22, yeah.
And there ought to be other ways to say, we have churches who are celebrating these lives. It may not be in a liturgical format, but Howard Thurman, that book you held up is being used as the basic textbook in the Sacred Ground program all over the Episcopal Church. I mean, EFM is using that book. Howard Thurman is becoming pretty bedrock in the Episcopal Church, even if there's not a liturgy honoring his life. And
yeah, and it reminds me of there's another book that I think is used in EFM, Dream of God by Verna Dozier. She might be another person to lift up.
So we need to start lifting up these voices.
This is being a little nitpicky, but I'm looking at the calendar and the dates that are proposed, and they share dates with other people, both with Williams, with William White, the first presiding bishop, and then William Law, the 18th century theologian. So I'm wondering, do you think that creates a conflict, or they could be overshadowed by these white leaders? One whose last name is actually White, or would you consider maybe, I'm thinking of Jonathan Myrick Daniels. He died on August 20th, and it's worth noticing that he's this young white promising white guy. I don't know how fast his process was, but the fact that he died certainly less than 50 years ago speaks to, I think, a sympathy towards young white seminarians more so than people from the black community. But he died on August 20th. That's the same date as the feast day of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who's the great last great church father. And so I don't know how they decided to then move his date to, or why they decided to do this, but they moved it to August 14th, which is the day he was arrested for protesting, along with SNCC, along with the Student Nonviolent. What is it? Coordinating.
Yeah, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
That's it. And that way he's not competing with Bernard of Clairvaux. So I'm wondering if I'm just a thought practice. Like, what would be another date if you did have to choose another date for John Lewis and or Howard Thurman? And I'm thinking about like Edmund Pettus Bridge when he almost died.
It's a good question. I don't know. The criterion also say it should be the day they died, but right. I would leave that to the General Convention and its committees if they wanted to move the date. Martin Luther King gets kind of moved around too. Right, his birthday, his death day. So I would leave it, if they were even hopefully interested in doing this, that would be one of the things.
Yeah, you'd be open
to look at. Yeah,
you'd be open any date. Yeah,
and frankly, we have lots of dates with multiple people on them, and the church and its pastors can pick who they want on that day.
And
in practical terms, when I was a rector and I had a midweek service, the first thing I do is go grab Lesser Feast and Fast and see, is today a saint day? And yay, great, and just bone up real fast. And I got a sermon, I mean, and I don't want to be cavalier about it, but I would not have heard of so many of these people had it not been that calendar.
Yes.
Nor would my people have known that. So I might do William White one year, and then the date rolls around next year, let's go do John Lewis. I mean, you got some options there. And frankly, there were an awful lot of midweek services where there was no saint. So I'd pick the person for tomorrow.
Right.
And I'd record it as, moved date or something like that. So, giving me more options, particularly for my midweek services.
I'm like that.
And it's like, oh God, I can't do William White one more year, So giving me some options is, if anything, welcome. So having more than one on a date actually really welcome. So
Karl Barth and Thomas Merton both died on December 10th, 1968, the same day, the same year, and I think they both share that same day, and they are
huge,
hugest theologians of the 20th century.
So I think sharing the date should be really not a real issue, I don't think.
I was trying to think, well, maybe, because I know, as you said, like, he almost died. He got arrested 40 times, but he almost died
on the bridge. That could be
bridge. Which is March 7th, 1965, which happens to be the day after my birthday, and there's no feast day on my birthday, which I was hoping there would be some, or even on my my ordination date. But anyway, I looked at March 7th. I thought that would be a one to suggest, but then I look at the calendar, and that's the feast day of Perpetua and Felicity, who are martyrs, first century martyrs. So either way, you're kind of.
Well, you got some choices. So
you got choices. That's
how
right.
rich is that? Right.
But I also heard that they're planning, or there's some discussion around changing the name of Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Yeah, there has been this guy, and I don't know where that stands.
Yeah, I don't know where that is, but
and Edmund Pettus is not a real admirable person.
Right, a Fender is also a grand dragon of the KKK.
Yeah.
The John Lewis Bridge, that would be something.
There you go.
Well, when I first saw those resolutions, I was really excited, and really glad that you got that going, and I love how we have a priest, a deacon, and a layperson co-sponsoring those.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So you bring a wealth of experience to this question that has come up in a lot of general conventions.
Mm-hmm.
That is now one of our resolutions for Diocesan Convention around welcoming people to the table who have not yet been baptized, which goes against Title I, Canon 17, Section 7. No unbaptized person shall be eligible to receive Holy Communion in this church. You've shared in town halls your perspective as well as some of the history with the diocese and Bishop Lamb. I'd love to hear more about your perspective, and I know a lot of people are of two minds, and I'd love to hear what the conversations were like at previous general conventions.
Well, so the little bit of history, it used to be in the Episcopal Church, you had to be confirmed before you could receive communion. And then the 79 prayer book changed that so that baptism was necessary for communion. So the idea behind that was once you're baptized, you're a full member of the church. There's no other, if you're fully in communion with the church, why would we deny you communion? So it was really a step towards full inclusion. And baptism, we've become very focused on what we call in seminary baptismal ecclesiology, how our faith is shaped by our baptism, by our baptismal covenant. And many people say, well, I was baptized as a baby, I don't remember it, so how could that be that important to me? It was a ritual my parents and my grandparents did, but it doesn't mean a whole lot to me. And I totally get that. But baptism is more than an intellectual process. It's also a recognition of the Holy Spirit working within us, a recognition of the church welcoming us into the fold of the church. It's the church declaring we need everybody of every age. Every babies bring gifts to our churches. So it's not about an intellectual process. It's about a Holy Spirit moment to be embraced by this church and Christ's own forever. It's why we don't do baptism more than once. Once you're in, you're in. You're there forever. You don't need to be rebaptized. So we've spent a lot of, we've worked on this. I don't know how well we portray that in our churches, but that's the focus. So what goes with that is saying, well, to be, when you're baptized, you're now welcome at the table. But then the practice has been growing up that people come to the table and we serve them communion. We don't check their baptismal cards at the railing. And there's, I think, a growing recognition that the spiritual life is not linear, that people may come to the Christian faith in a different direction than just born baptized communion. And I know I have baptized adults who never would have been open to baptism except they felt first welcome to the table. Bishop Lamb, his secretary Helen, her husband was murdered in a robbery. He was a sheriff's deputy. Bishop Lamb presided at this huge funeral for the slain officer. And I remember Bishop Lamb, who, by the way, before he was a priest, was a parole officer. So he looked out at the sea of cops, and he told this, it's his story, but he tells it, just very emotional about it. He said, I looked out at them and I said, I can't say only the baptized may come to communion. I've got to embrace these people. They're just hurting, so that was the moment for him to just say, just come, just Jesus loves you, Jesus feeds you, just come, so, but that goes against our constitution and canon on that. So the proposal before us is actually just to delete a phrase that says baptism, communion is for the baptized. And actually, I think if you read it without the phrase, we're actually just being silent on whether it's required. I think it has that effect. I think it's worth pondering that a little bit. And the way I reconcile this is to say, how do you reconcile this, the beauty of baptism with this? And the way I do is to say, first, I don't want you to think of baptism as a ticket. I think that cheapens baptism. But I think the Holy Eucharist, our communion, has its fullest expression as an outgrowth of our baptism. Its full meaning is part of our baptism. So, but if you've received communion and you haven't been baptized, you've still received some beautiful sacrament. It may not be in its fullest, whatever that is, but you still have received something valuable. And it maybe the Holy Spirit will bring you to baptism because of it, where you can experience it in its fullest expression. So rather than saying we're setting aside baptism, I'd like to see us look at this maybe through a little different lens or different angle. So maybe there's some, and I don't have the words for this, but maybe there's some way to express it in that Constitution, saying first that Holy Communion has its fullest expression in our baptism. And
I like that.
Leave it there.
That's ideal. And I think, I mean, a couple of things that, I don't think any of us nobody fully grasps the meaning of what's going on with baptism, with Eucharist. It's so profound and so many layers of meaning. I think one analogy that's not perfect, because it's created its own conflicts in the church and the Anglican Communion, but around sexual intimacy, right? Like, ideally, we uphold this idea of, okay, two people have made a commitment, and then they engage in this really intimate experience. Whereas if you just dive into that intimate experience without having any kind of understanding of what you're involved in, then that's generally considered somewhat irresponsible and could be hurtful. So I think that's, coming from the mystic perspective, what we're doing at the Eucharist is deeply intimate. We are putting the body of Christ into our bodies, and for someone to engage in that without having really any understanding of the intimacy can be problematic. And yet, as you said, like, some people have had that experience and then they're like, oh wow, this is powerful. I want to learn more. I now want to make the commitment. And I know you mentioned you've baptized people who were drawn to baptism through Eucharist. My experience tends to be almost the opposite. And if I had read this resolution 10 years ago, I would have thought that's a slam dunk. Of course, yes, we should welcome everyone. And all the churches I went to, I was confirmed at All Saints Pasadena. Like, of course, everybody's like, yes, all are welcome to receive communion. But in my experience, I notice in my parishioners this real respect for the sacrament. So that there's some people who say, I want to receive communion, but I'm not yet baptized. I want to get baptized. And during COVID, when we were saying, hey, we have little containers of consecrated wafers, come by and pick them up, this young woman picked up her wafers for Lent, and she realized after talking to her mom that she actually is not yet baptized, and she said, should I not consume these? And I was like, well, technically, according to our canons, you got to be baptized before you consume it, but I'm not going to force that. And she said, well, I'm going to put them in a special place until I'm baptized. And it took a long time. It took several months, because we waited for Bishop Megan to come and confirm others. And so that's given me like this new perspective that parishioners tend to bring this deep awe and appreciation for the mystery of the Eucharist. So some of the reasons that were given in the resolution, like, oh, um, this is going to make more people feel welcome. This is going to, limit uncomfortable visitors. In my experience, that doesn't resonate. And yet I know there are other people's experiences like your own.
Well, I think it's not a good argument to say this is an evangelism tool. Let's just give out wafers. That kind of cheapens it, frankly, as you're describing. But I also think people can have this mystical experience sitting in the pew, and it isn't like they just walked in to pick up a wafer. It's like they've sung the hymns and heard the lessons and the sermon, and something motivates them to, like, I just got to come forward. It's like, it's our version of an altar call.
Yeah, right. We have altar calls every Sunday. That's right.
Yeah, and I just have to come forward.
Come to
in a Baptist church, they wouldn't say you can come to the altar call after you're baptized. That's right. I got to come forward, and then you hope and pray. They go, wow, I just got to do something more here. And conversely, we have people who've been taking communion their whole lives who just take communion because that's what they do. So, I mean, we've got to be, I think, kind of open to the beauty of this communion and all of its expression.
Yes, right.
You also asked about General Convention with it. I would not expect that this will, I think this will, I don't even know if we'll get out of our own convention. It probably will, but I would not expect it will get anywhere at General Convention, because this never has. And one of the major reasons is it puts us out of step with other, the rest of the churches, the Catholics, the Lutherans, and everybody else. And it would be probably received as, there go the arrogant American Episcopalians again, without bothering to consult us, without thinking about any of this. That certainly will be the reaction in the Church of England and everywhere else. So, and we have a bicameral legislature, and that will be the reaction of our bishops, and that's probably where it will not go very far. But this conversation, I think, we've got to have this conversation, because if only, especially so that we get a deeper understanding of what Holy Communion is.
Right.
And not just arguing over, is it physically the body of Christ? Is it, the old medieval arguments isn't what we're arguing over here. It's really, what is its meaning in our lives? And what does it mean to have this intimate experience? And we don't talk about that very much. Okay. And I have a little connection here. So when we were arguing over same-sex marriage and blessings, what it forced us to do is have a conversation around what is marriage and what is a blessing, and what do we mean by these vows? Is this something more than being a pretty church, for a social activity? It forced us to come to grips with, if this is a sacrament, what does it really mean to us? And that was not an easy conversation, as it turned out, for us to have. And maybe it's now we got to have this one. What does it mean to have communion every week? What does our baptism really mean to us? What's that about? Is this just a rite of passage, or what? So I think it's a very welcome conversation. At Anaheim is the first time I heard Michael Curry preach.
Oh, wow. The Bishop of North Carolina.
Bishop of North Carolina. And he was the last preacher at the last event, and he just sort of knocked our socks off.
I bet.
And that was his Crazy Christians sermon.
Oh, yes.
That he made it into a book. So, And I think we all kind of knew right then and there. He'll be the presiding bishop. It's just sort of
Oh
obvious.
yeah, like when he was on the slate a few years ago, I was like,
Yeah.
oh, that's obviously. I mean,
Yeah, and he was elected on the first ballot. That just never happens. So,
oh, we're so blessed by him.
well, this next general convention in Baltimore will be his last
Oh, is that right?
as
Okay.
presiding bishop. We will be we'll be electing a new president of the House of Deputies, and then there is a committee that's already been elected to begin the search for a new presiding bishop.
Okay, wow.
Actually, it's almost as elaborate as electing a diocesan bishop. So even though the pool of candidates is small,
How do they go about? Is it kind of seniority, or is it like how do they go about choosing?
they have to set up the criterion they're looking for, and they'll write a profile just like a diocese does for a bishop, and then there will be bishops nominated or applying, and they will at the convention that comes after Baltimore I forgot what city we'll be in.
Louisville.
Louisville, and there before that convention, they will release a slate of candidates.
But they're not going to vote in Louisville, are they?
They will vote in Louisville.
Oh, they will. Okay, wow.
Yeah, and the bishops are the voters, but then it has to be confirmed by the House of Deputies.
Got it.
Gay Clark has made it abundantly clear that the House of Deputies will not be a rubber stamp, and a committee will be appointed to then determine whether who the bishops voted for is the right person. So it won't just be all in favor say aye.
As somebody who has been to many general conventions, what's the scuttlebutt around potential candidates, or have you heard?
The person I would like to have managed to get herself on the committee. So I guess you're not going to be a candidate. So I don't know. I don't really have any. I know a few bishops, but they don't really talk about this stuff. So with the rest of us, so
that's exciting.
And it's a little soon. It's a little too soon. So.
Right, it's a little too far away.
And I am not even sure whether Michael Curry is eligible for re-election. I know Catherine Jeffers Shorey was eligible, but she chose not to be.
I didn't know that was an option.
That's a 9-year term, so
he probably doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, I mean it would be, and I'd make him, he's 67, 68 right now. So.
And that's in the canons, right? The 9-year term.
Yeah. Oh. So I doubt he would be running for re-election. But the first question they'll be asked is Michael wanting to run for re-election? And one of the things with Catherine was you could run for re-election and then resign, 2 or 3 years into this if you wanted to. And then she said that's a lousy system. So.
See. I had a chance to meet soon before coming up to Eureka. I had a chance to meet the Bishop of Pennsylvania, William White's successor, Daniel Gutierrez, and I wonder if he would be a good candidate, or if he'd be open to it.
I don't know. I would expect Andy Doyle of Texas.
Oh, right, yeah.
Would be. I would like Jennifer Baskerville Burroughs to be, but she's on the committee, so I don't know. In the past, you had to have been a bishop at least 5 years before you're eligible. So, and we have an awful lot of new bishops right now who won't meet the 5-year test anyway. So.
Right, yeah. Is that also in the canons, 5 years, or is that?
I don't know. I know. I'm not sure if that's a canon or if that was just the criterion the last time around. We'll have to go study that a little more closely.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know if mine's updated. This is 2015. I guess, yeah. You made that distinction,
Yeah,
which I know you
yeah,
emphasized that in the town halls as well. There's the delegation and the deputation. What I think that's helpful to know the difference in
yeah.
those terms. But what what is the meaning behind that those different names? I mean, why is that a distinction that's worth?
Well, and it's going back to the early days of the Episcopal Church, and I think that history is a little murky, but I think the idea of deputies versus delegates. A delegate is delegated to represent the opinions and feelings of a district. So if I'm a delegate, I'm there to reflect you if you elected me. A deputy is there to discern independently.
Ah,
We have called these deputies
wow.
not because we trust in their discernment
So you're
powers.
not, in a sense, you're representing the diocese, but you're not. Your votes and your decisions are not necessarily purely reflecting
Exactly. And and
diocese.
yeah, politically in reality, of course, we elect people who we think are close to what we think we are. But deputies are supposed, and I've heard Gay Jennings Clark, who's the president of the House of Deputies, say this many times. You are here as a deputy. You are here to vote your conscience. You are here to discern the Holy Spirit for the church. You're not here to play politics. You're here to be a deputy in the you're deputized to make decisions for this
Yeah.
church.
And what an honor it is to be elected. I mean, you have to be elected to be a deputy, I'd
You
imagine,
do.
in all dioceses. And you have been I know you're part of the deputation, you're a deputy for,
I'm an alternate, and
oh, you're an alternate. Okay.
I'm the first clergy alternate, and we serve in order of our votes.
I see. Right. Right. But you've
And
been a deputy in past years.
I have, believe it or not, I have never been a deputy. I have been an alternate 4 or 5 times since 1996. I've been to, this will be my fifth general convention.
So, but by
Um,
being there, you get to, watch and pay attention to the
yeah,
conversation.
and when deputies need a break, alternates go on the floor, and there's actually a little bit of strategy goes on with some dioceses where if there's an issue where an alternate has a passion or an expertise, a deputy will step out and the alternate will come in as a deputy.
Got it. Got it.
We've seen that with Ruth Myers in the Diocese of California when she's been an alternate, and
I see.
she's like the leading liturgy expert of the church. And when they're doing the things on liturgy, she's going in as a deputy. So,
Right. Right.
so it's not quite so cut right. And there's a reason we take alternates. Um,
Yeah.
Also,
Well,
the alternates, their committee. This is like the Congress, and there's committee hearings. And this year, it's going to be all committee hearings will be in the morning and legislation in the afternoon. It's going to be a little less crazy than it's been in past years, where they do committee hearings at night and everybody's hungry. So,
right. Right.
um, but
But you said
alternates.
you've been to the last, what, five?
I've been to the ones I've been to are the last one was in Austin. Was it that one? Before that, Salt Lake. Before that,
Anaheim. I was in Anaheim.
Cincinnati. I didn't go to that one. Before that, it was in Anaheim. I went to that one. One was in St. Paul, Minnesota. I didn't do that. Before that, I went to Philadelphia. So, I haven't been to every one since '96. But alternates can divvy up and go to the committee hearings as an extra set of eyes and ears and testify at the committees. And so really the deputation is both the deputies and the alternates who can spread out. And
Yeah. You are pretty sure that other names of African Americans are being brought to General Convention.
yeah, I know several dioceses will be putting forward Barbara Harris. Yeah, there is a big movement behind that. And
Oh, yeah.
there is. And Barbara Harris was the first Black,
First female.
first
First
female and
without
first
the
Black female bishop of not just our church, but the whole of the Anglican Communion. And she also just died last year. So.
She's a powerhouse. Yeah, I did have a chance to. She was the guest speaker at Diocesan Convention in Diocese of California. I think my last year there.
Yeah, so there's a big push going on in several places to Barbara Harris. So.
And I'm guessing Desmond Tutu is going to be considered, but he's got to graduate.
In the fullness of time. Yeah.
In the fullness of time, yes. Any other names
but
that you're...
again, that's like, why do we have to wait 50 years to do Desmond Tutu and Barbara Harris, for goodness sake?
50 years.
Really? Come on.
Yeah. So, I don't.
It makes no sense. So.
Yeah, I'm actually not a fan of that idea.
Yeah.
Any other names that you are familiar with?
Not that I'm familiar. Well, they are actually taking one name off. Edward DeBose, and he was the founder of the seminary at Swanee, and he was a white supremacist. He owned slaves. He fought in the Confederate Army. He will be coming off the calendar. But
that makes sense.
So people can come off. It's
get demoted.
There's one I'm very interested in that there was forward 3 years ago who they studied and they rejected, and I haven't seen why they rejected, and that's Ida Wells, who owned this black newspaper in Memphis in the 1870s. She was a suffragette. She's an extraordinary human being, and the women's suffrage movement would not have black women in it. And Ida Wells led her own marches for the vote for women. She's an extraordinary human being, but they don't want Ida Wells. So I'm not quite sure why, but I would expect we'll see that won't go away either. So.
One name that came up in our leadership call with the diocese was an African-American Episcopalian who just died, a couple weeks ago, or a week ago, who I don't know if he necessarily resembles Christian virtues certainly not in the same way John Lewis does, but Colin Powell. He certainly did. He was a soldier, just like, John Lewis was a nonviolent soldier. He was a soldier who was faithful in serving country, and he was a faithful Episcopalian. I can't see him being on our calendar, but I'm just wondering if if a staunch Republican gets a little uncomfortable. Oh, why are we lifting up this Democrat without also lifting up this other?
And someone may make that argument.
Yeah, I can't picture somebody doing that, but my dogs don't like that idea at all. But
there's a lot to admire about Colin Powell.
Yeah, certainly.
But the Iraq War is frankly a problem. So.
Yeah, and his insisting that there were weapons of mass destruction, and yet him apologizing for that. I think he does, or acknowledging that was a mistake. He is admirable for sure.
But I love we're having these conversations about people, and putting on my biographer hat. I think I love it when people have conversations around.
Yeah, and I'm just like you.
Who matter,
Right. We don't do midweek Eucharists. We did Compline, but I feel like I weave in the saints almost every Sunday. I'm always mentioning a feast day. Like just yesterday, I mentioned the fact that I basically preached on Saint Simon and Saint Jude, whose feast days are coming up. They're kind of a major feast day on October 28th. So yeah, I'm just like that. And the idea of proposing a resolution that could then add somebody like John Lewis or Howard Thurman to the calendar, that's exciting. And what a great legacy for you to be giving the church. So I'm supporting that and hope it goes forward. And yeah, I understand it might be the long haul that we got to be working towards. It might not happen right away.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'll let you get some dinner. Send my greetings to Lori, and
absolutely.
Please, next time you want to make plans to come up, let's make it happen.
We will next time.
All right.
All right. You take
Peace and
care.
blessing.
Say hi to Ashley. See you
Will
soon.
do.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.